Gainesville, The Villages, 1370 AM, 96.3 FM, The Source.
Did you ever want to be an astronaut, Robin?
Oh, no, I wanted to be an astronomer, though.
Oh, you want to look at the stars?
Yeah, I didn't want
I
to
wanted
travel up
to
there.
go to the stars. The only problem is you got to be really smart to do that.
Yeah.
You can't just be physically in shape. You got to be mentally in shape, too, right?
That's right. But I like the science.
But even when I was a kid, I remember when I was a kid, I was living in New York, and we came down here to Florida as a family. And one of the places we went to was the Space Center. I don't know if it was called Kennedy at that time, or if it was still called, whatever it was called back then, Cape Canaveral, I guess.
Yeah, Cape Canaveral.
But I remember going there, I was in awe. I was in awe. And then, of course, give it a few years later, and we're on the moon. Human beings are, not me and my family. But so now, you look at the things that we've been able to accomplish, and you look at the things that scientists understand. When we saw that movie, Hidden Figures, right?
Yes, fabulous.
First of all, you realize that it wasn't just men; it was women too. It wasn't just white men; it was black women, and you realize that so much. But the thing I took away from that was how amazing math plays a role in the understanding of the world around us, right? That whole movie, it had a lot of layers to it, right?
It did.
And we could talk about any of them, but the one I wanted to focus on for this interview is the math, because the math, or maybe the math and science, really, really are at the core of what that whole thing is about. So now, fast forward to what we're talking about in addition to traveling through space, but just taking care of our own planet, right? There was a story this morning about how the Pacific Ocean is warmer this year than 1 year ago. And where that's coming from, and what that could do to the whole planet. I remember something just earlier this week, I think, about one of the ice. The amount of ice on the North Pole is going away.
Yeah.
So you can tell I'm stumbling through the topic because you know what I do for a living? I talk on a microphone. So I don't study any of this. Thomas Allen Neumann, on the other hand, has studied all of this. He is a geophysicist. He serves as the ICESat-2 project scientist at NASA. He does science outreach work. He does field work on the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets. He led expeditions between the two poles. He is an affiliate assistant professor in Earth and Space Sciences at the University of Washington. Thank you for giving me all those amazing notes, Robin. He's going to tell us how the latest heat wave in Europe may impact the Arctic. Thomas Allen Neumann, it's an honor to have you on our show. Good morning.
Good morning. It's great to be here.
Yeah. So we're talking about, do I use the term global warming with this conversation?
Yeah, you absolutely can.
Okay, so what's happening? What have you observed? And it's been your personal observation as well as those of other scientists, right?
Yeah, that's right. So I work on a mission called ICESat-2 that you alluded to in the intro there, and that launched about a year ago. ICESat-2 is using lasers in space to measure the height of the world globally. But it's really optimized to measure the changes in the height of the ice in Greenland and Antarctica, as well as the height of sea ice.
How long have we been measuring that?
It's interesting. We've been able to measure the extent of sea ice, like how has the coverage changed through time, since about 1979. But we were not able to measure that third dimension of sea ice, the thickness, very well. But ICESat-2 is proving to be a really capable tool for giving us that new view into the sea ice that we haven't really had before.
Is the sea ice the same as the word glaciers?
So it's actually it's funny because ice is ice and it's all the same. But there's a distinction to be drawn between sea ice, which is formed by freezing ocean water. So in the Arctic Ocean in winter, it gets cold enough to freeze the surface of the ocean, and so sea ice grows in ocean water, and the extent of that ice pack gets larger in winter when it's cold, and it melts back every year in the summer. In contrast, a glacier or an ice sheet is formed by the accumulation of snow on land. So someplace like Antarctica or Greenland, we've had snowfall for the last many, many thousands and thousands of years, and that snow just accumulates and accumulates, and it doesn't melt each summer. So that's ice that's actually sitting on land. And so when Greenland loses ice, that runs off as water and goes back into the ocean and changes sea level. So it's those two different kinds of ice: sea ice, floating in the ocean, and glaciers and ice sheets, which are sitting on rock.
So the notes say something about a heat wave in Europe. Is there not a heat wave on the whole planet?
There is. The note there was mostly about how warm this particular summer has been, and some events during the summer that were particularly unusual, even in a warm summer.
Okay.
So 2019 is shaping up to be one of the warmest summers we've had, and Greenland had a melt event in late July and early August. We heard about that heat wave in Europe a few weeks earlier, and that system actually did end up moving north. And temperatures in Greenland were almost 17 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than they usually are.
Wow, that's a lot.
That kind of takes your 90-degree day and turns it into 107 degrees if you were here in Maryland. So it's really a hot week.
We were told that you have a satellite that measures the sea ice thickness in the Arctic. How does that measure it, as opposed to if humans would be there at their base camps and measure? Can they do that?
Yeah, that's right. So people can measure the sea ice thickness from, say, ships or from submarines. That's pretty much what we used to do back in the 80s. But with IceSat-2, the satellite that launched about a year ago, it's measuring the height of everything. And the way we measure the thickness of sea ice is to measure the height of the floating ice and compare that with the height of the ocean water that it's sitting in. And if you had a ice cube floating in your glass of water, you'd notice that about 10% of that ice cube is above the water line and 90% of it is below the surface. We do the same thing with IceSat-2. We measure how much that sea ice is sticking up out of the water, and we use that measurement to figure out how thick the whole sea ice is. Go ahead.
Does it move? Like we talk about glaciers, like moving, like a river of ice. Does the sea ice also travel?
It does. Glaciers and ice sheets move at a speed of meters per year, tens of meters per year, maybe up to a kilometer per year. Sea ice floating in the ocean is subject to ocean currents, wind events, and it's really dynamic, and it can move tens of kilometers per day. So it's really moving around quite a lot.
In addition to whatever it is that we as humans are doing that might change the climate, are the things that we hear about in nature, for example, volcanoes, are they also warming or cooling the Earth?
That's right. There are natural factors at play, such as volcanoes or changes in cloud cover. But what we found by accumulating data from, of course, not just IceSat-2, but many different kinds of measurements from space on the ground, is that you can't explain the observed warming without the addition of people. That we really are the big driver for the changes that we've been seeing the last decade or so.
Does the information that you have give us clues as to what we can do to clean up our act, to do a better job of being stewards of the planet?
So here at NASA, our job is, and my job is, to make sure we're collecting the best data that we can. And what I mean by that is really high quality data that reduces the uncertainties in how sea ice thickness is changing or in how the mass of the Greenland ice sheet is changing. And by taking really good, high-quality data, we can say with more and more certainty exactly how the planet is changing. Policymakers and decision-makers can use that information to figure out how best we, as you put it, kind of clean up our act or become better stewards of the planet, because that gets into areas of economics and social science and behavioral science that really aren't my forte.
I feel like I'm dragging you someplace maybe that is not your
totally
area. But I often wonder like if I ride a bicycle, that would solve my car problem, but there's going to be a little issue there. But if I had an electric car, and again, I apologize if I'm taking you down a road you don't want to go, but if I had an electric car, would it actually make a difference considering that the electricity is also being created by something that pollutes the atmosphere?
Yeah, that's true. One of the ways to think about it is that in your car driving around with gas, that you're generating carbon dioxide at the point of your car, right? So it's like each one of these cars is generating its own little emissions. If you're using something like electricity, all that electricity is being generated somewhere else entirely, and it's a concentrated emission, if you will. It's coming from a power plant. So making a change to how we generate electricity, or how that power plant works, or how we capture some of the carbon dioxide or other pollution is easier if you have just one big one to worry about at, say, a power plant, versus thousands of small ones driving around on the roads.
Okay.
How is this affecting the animals and the cultures? Because the Inuits, they use the whales as their food source and source clothing and also for their livelihood for exports.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, and those communities are really on the forefront of climate change. Not only the Inuit in, say, Greenland or northern Canada, but also in Alaska. A lot of those near coastal communities have seen not only the sea level changing, but also sea ice conditions change, which impact how the animals move around and whether they can. Communities can get in and out more or less easily for fishing or for that sort of thing. So those changes really are, impacting those communities directly.
And what would happen, say, just to pretend here, if all of the ice melted? How much of the continents would be gone, and would the human race survive?
So for sea ice, it's already floating in the ocean. So when sea ice melts, it doesn't change the sea level at all, because it's like your ice cube in a glass of water. It's already floating in the ocean. But for land ice, like let's say glaciers in Antarctica or Greenland, if all of Greenland were to melt, it would raise sea levels by about 20 feet.
Oh.
If we then added in all of Antarctica, that would raise sea level by almost 100 feet.
Oh,
which
no.
would be a tremendous change.
We got to stop that, because we are at 100 feet above sea level.
Yes, we are, right here.
We'd have to turn off the radio
station. Have the effects of sea level rise way before we lost the entire Antarctic ice sheet.
How old were you when you started being fascinated with everything like this?
That's interesting. I was in college, actually. I was at the University of Chicago, and trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life and what major I wanted to be. And I took a class from a professor named Doug McHale on the Ice Age Earth. And it was all about how, 15, 20,000 years ago, the planet was just a really different place. We had big glaciers in Canada that reached all the way down through New York State, and sea levels were much different than they are now. And that was in the early 90s, and what really got me was that, he painted this picture of how the world was so different, and at least at that point, we didn't really understand why. Why did these glaciers grow in Canada? Why are they gone now? What changed about the planet to take us from an ice age to out of an ice age, and how did it happen so quickly? And I was like, you got to be kidding. We don't know why these things happen. And of course, as you get farther and farther into studying these things over time, we learn a lot more, and the picture kind of becomes refined. But that really got my attention. I mean, I grew up in Wisconsin, where 15, 20,000 years ago, it was under a half a mile of ice.
Robin grew up in Wisconsin too, but not that long ago.
No, Milwaukee.
Are you able to study the polar caps of other planets like Mars, for example? And are they also changing at all, or do they stay the same because there's nobody living there?
there's certainly nobody living on Mars, at least not yet.
Well, Tesla wants to go. I mean, not Tesla. What's that guy's name? Whatever. Musk. Elon
There are
Musk.
folks who study those polar caps, and I actually had the opportunity to work on a project where we were trying to measure the flow rates of the Martian ice caps. Of course, on Mars, it's much colder, and that makes the ice a lot stiffer, and it moves very, very little. It was kind of a not very exciting paper because it kind of concluded, well, they're not changing.
Oh, really? So that's that right there is evidence that it is us, because you always hear this argument that I believe it's changing, but I don't believe it's us. You always hear that argument, and I think, I mean, since I have you on the phone, I might as well just come out and ask you, because as a radio host, this comes up all the time, and everybody is an expert. And not really, it's in quotes, but I mean, they'll use Google and they'll quote somebody. And it just drives me nuts. So I'm glad we have you. I'm going to save all this in my head. Robin, don't let me forget any of this stuff.
Okay.
The other thing that I keep in mind or remind folks of, it's because we'll hear that often, that it's like, oh, it's a super cold week here in D.C., so much for global warming. But it's really that longer term view that we're talking about. How has weather and climate changed from the 1960s to today, or even in the satellite era from the early 1980s to today? You put that data together and you see these pronounced trends in the change in sea level, the change in the mass of the ice sheets in Antarctica and Greenland, and the change in sea ice extent, which we were talking about earlier.
Have you ever tripped over any penguins on your expeditions? Because I just think they're so they are such a fascinating entity.
And they get in the way every time.
They are. They're super curious. I've been down in Antarctica before, and by treaty, you're not allowed to harass the local wildlife. However, if you sit down at a respectful distance away, it's not uncommon that they come over to check you out and see what you're doing.
Who signed that treaty? There's nobody who signed the treaty. We actually had. We have a funny little story. We had a lady on, and she had her thing was she was an older lady. I don't remember how old, but she's
in her 80s.
She was up there, and she was a jogger. She liked to run, and she was telling us that she ran on every single continent. So I had to ask her, did you see any penguins when you ran down in Antarctica? Obviously, if you ran on that continent, and she did. I guess when you run down there, they're there. I guess they're looking at you and stuff.
Absolutely. They're all over the place around the coast in Antarctica.
So what is it like? Like, can I just get away from the science for a second? I'm just curious. What is life like for you as a scientist living in that extreme area?
It's interesting because the U.S. has a base on the edge of Antarctica. It's called McMurdo Station, and it's run by the National Science Foundation. And it's basically a little town. There's sort of 1,000 or so people there in the summer. You can fly down there from New Zealand on military aircraft. It's run by the Air National Guard, and it's a whole little town. There's a galley. They have dorms for people to stay in, and you're down there doing science. So they have folks who are supporting, say, the snowmobiles and the camping equipment and all that sort of thing. And then science groups from all over the country and around the world come through McMurdo as their base of operations. And from there, you go off to wherever your field site is. I'm mostly an ice sheet guy, and so we would come through McMurdo, pick up our equipment and do our safety training and all of that sort of thing, and then head into the interior away from the coast to do whatever project we were working on that year, whether it's putting out weather stations, collecting snow and ice samples, all sorts of different things.
And how do
It's a really unique place.
Well, how do you then communicate with your family or other people in the outside world? Are there satellite links, or are you cut off?
Absolutely. It's gotten a lot different. The first year I went down was 1997, which isn't that long ago, but it's 20 years now. And at that time, your communication was primarily by HF radio, so you could talk back to McMurdo. You check in once a day, tell them, hey, we're still here, we're all fine, everything's going fine. But now with the advent of satellite phones, you can just pick up your satellite phone, call your mom, and wish her a happy birthday.
Oh, how wonderful.
All right.
You are so fascinating.
Another question about Antarctica. I guess I have to ask you probably a dumb question. Are there mountains on Antarctica, and are they really, really tall, or is it pretty much a flat continent?
So there are mountain ranges in Antarctica. Some of them are below the level of the ice sheet, because these glaciers and ice sheets grow by accumulating snow for thousands and thousands of years.
Wow.
So under the ice sheet, there's mountain ranges. Around the coast of Antarctica, lots of those mountains, stick up through the ice sheet, and some of those are really big. The tallest mountain down there is called Vincent Massif, and I forget off the top of my head how tall it is. I thought it was about 18,000 feet above sea level. So it's something taller than Mount Rainier. It's about as tall as Denali.
Wow.
But yeah, there's big mountain ranges down there, and if you follow, let's say, National Geographic or something like that, occasionally they'll have photo essays, photojournalists that head down there with climbing groups. These people go down there to climb these mountains and do first ascents and things like that. Lots of adventurers.
Are the cruise ships part of the problem?
Cruise ships are interesting. They're mostly on the Antarctic Peninsula side, so that's the little thumb of Antarctica that sticks up towards Chile and Argentina in South America. And the cruise ships typically go from Chile or Argentina down to the peninsula to have a look at penguins and icebergs and that sort of thing. And it's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it's great that people get to travel down there and experience it and see it and raise awareness about it. But on the other hand, those are really fragile ecosystems, and bringing in big cruise ships with hundreds of people in some cases can be damaging to those environments.
Oh my God!
So fascinating. I think we could probably talk to you for bunches of hours. Can you leave us with something? Is there a book you would recommend we could read if we wanted to learn more, especially about the heat wave and how it impacts the ice on the planet, or maybe a website or something?
Yeah, so one cool way to follow us is through social media. We've got Facebook accounts and that sort of thing, and we are NASA_ice. We're on social media. We actually have teams in the field in Greenland right now. A group called Operation Icebridge is there with an aircraft doing surveys, and another project out of JPL called Oceans Melting Greenland, or OMG. They're in the field this week as well, and they're posting pictures and updates about how things are going.
So we were talking this morning about podcasts. One of my favorite podcasts is Houston, We Have a Podcast. Are you familiar with that one?
That one I'm not, but I'll totally look it up.
Oh my gosh, it's so good. It's made by NASA. And it's so good. So do you guys, your department, do you guys have a podcast I can maybe subscribe to?
Oh yeah, do you have one?
We don't have a podcast for NASA Ice. We have YouTube videos and YouTube series and that sort of thing.
Okay.
But at least at the moment, we don't have an ice-focused podcast.
Uh-oh.
Now you got me thinking about it.
I hear one coming on, yeah. Yeah, let me know, because I love radio, obviously, and I love listening to, I learned so much from the Houston We've Got a Podcast. It's so much fun to learn about, and we don't live that far away from the Space Center, so it's...
Right.
You kind of can relate to it a little bit. Thomas, I am so impressed. Thank you so much for being on the air with us today. And please come back. Where are you? Did you tell me? Where are you?
Yeah, so it's been my pleasure being on the show, first of all. You guys have awesome questions, and it's been a lot of fun. I'm up here at NASA Goddard Space Flight Center, just outside of the Beltway in D.C. It's right between Washington, D.C. and Baltimore, Maryland.
All right, very good. Are the private... efforts to do what NASA has done all these years a good relationship for NASA, or is it an issue?
Private efforts meaning
like with the guy
Elon Musk,
etc. Those the private efforts to go to the moon, for example.
Yeah. Totally got it. We couldn't do what we do without the support of all kinds of different contractors, whether it's SpaceX providing different ways to access space through their launch vehicles, or actually with ICESat-2, we work quite a bit with Northrop Grumman Information Systems to do our ground system and build part of our spacecraft. So while we designed and built a lot of ICESat-2 right here at NASA Goddard, we used industry partners where we could to fill in the holes for us.
It's exciting, and we are so glad there are people on this planet who understand this stuff, because otherwise we wouldn't be good stewards if it wasn't for the understanding that you enable us to have. Thomas, thank you. Thomas,
thanks again for having me.
Thank you. We'll be right back.
Now the Dorian is long gone. It's going to be hot and dry for most of the weekend. Sunshine and some clouds on this Friday. It'll be hot with a high of 93 at the coast, 97 inland, and patchy clouds Friday night. Lows in the upper